Welcome back to Governance This Week as we talk about trade and technology. We have with us Professor Andrea Renda to talk about how the EU and the US are trying to align on trade and technology. And Andrea works on all things digital here at the School of Transnational Governance, but also at SEPS in Brussels. He's also the director of the Trade and Technology Dialogue, which is designed to support the EU-US Trade and Technology Council, which we're going to learn more about during this conversation. Andrea, great to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
Excellent. So, Andrea, the European Commission and the US administration, they are meeting on 30 and 31st of May in Sweden for the fourth summit of this Trade and Technology Council, TTC. So, let's start right there. Can you help us understand what the TTC is exactly and why it was set up?
Yes, thank you, Roland. The TTC is technically defined as a forum between the European Union and the United States. So it's not a trade agreement. It's not a meeting that really is supposed to produce a comprehensive set of rules that are shared by the two parties. But it's a forum that is composed largely of 10 working groups, dedicated obviously to trade and technology, and it is supposed to build some alignment and convergence on specific positions between the United States and the European Union, with a number of specific goals that have been specified already in mid-2021, in June 2021, when the TTC was first launched. The idea is to strengthen the industrial leadership, the joint industrial leadership of the two, to promote democratic values around the world through trade and technology, and also to agree on some future standards, right? So that the action of the two big blocs can be coordinated at the global level.
So you mentioned actually that there are several working groups, and we have had, I think we are now at the fourth meeting at the end of May. Could you give us some examples of the kind of things that are being discussed, and also how far have things gone already? Where are we at?
Well, this has been an interesting journey until now, right? We are coming to the fourth meeting next week in northern Sweden. At the beginning, I think there's been a lot of caution, big resounding statements, but a little bit of a flirting face, if you wish, or a trust-building face, if you want to use a more, let's say, professional term, meaning that two parties have started to align their positions and, for example, exchange information on a number of things. So an agreement has been reached on exchanging information on disruption in supply chains, so the two parties can keep each other informed. But also, increasingly, there is cooperation on subsidies, on initiatives that are industrial policy initiatives in the US and in the EU, so that they can be coordinated rather than leading to a subsidies race. There are initiatives to work together on very critical sources of supply and, for example, on raw materials or on semiconductors. And so these things are happening, but very gradually. There is no big bang, let's say, in the Trade and Technology Council. It is becoming gradually more ambitious. And I think next week's meeting is actually going to be the most ambitious of the four so far, with finally some initial very resounding statements, but also results in terms of concrete initiatives being launched.
Andrea, you mentioned subsidies already for a moment, and actually this is one of those issues which have put the two parties at odds in recent months. Could you kind of elaborate a little bit on that? Why?
Well, the big shock in a situation in which both blocs have continuously been engaging in industrial policy measures, if you wish, but the big shock has been when the United States launched the Inflation Reduction Act last year, and that also showed a new commitment of the US to achieve leadership also on clean energy, right? This is an initiative that also is coupled with others, such as the CHIPS Act in the US, but it's the most important in the sense that it mobilizes something like $400 billion in support of clean energy. And part of this is really repatriating technology to reduce dependency on China, sort of $60–70 billion are dedicated to that. So really bringing back production from what I consider to be cheaper places, or in the logic of global supply chains and global value chains, to the US to really make sure that the risk of disruption of the supply chain is minimized. And at the same time, there is a number of tax credit provisions that are somehow discriminatory in the sense that the tax credit can be accessed only by those producers that assemble their products in the US or use batteries that have a minimum number of components or raw materials that come from the US or from trade partners of the US, for example, Canada and Mexico, but not from the EU. So this has created a lot of concern. In the EU, there have been many stakeholders and particular business players that started saying, we want the made in Europe provision. So we want to start competing on the made in strategies with the US. And this has created the fear of a subsidies race that can perhaps be good if taken, if coordinated somehow and based on some basic preconditions and rules. It can also be bad in the sense of wasting a lot of resources trying to compete. If it's good, it's great, because ultimately the Inflation Reduction Act, in my opinion, is much better than having the EU completely disengaged or disenfranchised from the climate debate. It's actually a major industrial policy measure. It is perhaps also an anti-Chinese measure, but at the same time, perhaps even sometimes for the wrong reasons, but it goes in the direction of making the US again a leader in the climate talks, in the climate commitments. It can lead to an estimated 30-40% of emissions reductions by 2030. So it is a massive thing. And if the EU and the US manage to do similar things, imagine the US accounts for 13% of global emissions alone. So if the EU and the US manage to coordinate in subsidizing cleaner energy and perhaps reducing their dependencies on countries that otherwise could blackmail them, this is actually a fantastic result. Only that result, if this is achieved, would be a fantastic result, achieved also through the TTC. And I want to mention that one of the key things that have happened after the Inflation Reduction Act was enacted, some obviously responses and reactions on the EU side, the Green Deal Action Plan, the Net Zero Industry Act, talks on relaxing state aid rules for cleaner technologies, but also the fact that the TTC was there facilitated dialogue. And I think this is actually a good thing. The fact that you have a platform in place and a task force on the Inflation Reduction Act was created immediately when the EU started voicing its concerns around the end of last year. And now this task force is producing a dialogue on clean energy subsidies and incentives that will see the light next week. It will be announced. And so there will be an action plan for how to unfold this dialogue going forward. And so how to coordinate incentive for clean energy. This is perhaps one of the best news in terms of future emissions reductions, one of the best news that we've had over the past years.
Yeah. So if I understand correctly, Andrea, through the TTC, well, we can actually expect some concrete steps forward, in the area of subsidies that will make a difference.
I think so. This is what I would expect. You wouldn't expect from the TTC a treaty, but you should expect concrete actions that are coordinated. And in that respect, there are initiatives both between the two parties, again, this dialogue on clean energy incentives, but also the endorsement, the joint endorse common standards, for example, on electrical vehicle charging devices. And so this is something that will be showcased and announced next week as well. The first standard that is jointly endorsed by the two parties in a, very well, Roland, you travel like I do. When you go to the US, you know how many standards are different, right? From plugs, and sockets onwards. And so having common chargers is great. Having similar endeavors and goals and coordinating procurement, green public procurement in particular, that is also very important. And having a joint strategy to ensure that the market balance is tilted in favor of those products that are more sustainable as opposed to the ones that have more embedded emissions. This is also very important. So I would expect concrete results. And these concrete results, I think, might even be more concrete because of the scare, if you wish, of the Inflation Reduction Act.
The agenda is quite encompassing, Andrea. In fact, something we haven't touched upon, but which we can't really get around these days, is artificial intelligence, and Washington and Brussels are also joining hands on, addressing this important topic that is evolving so quickly together. Obvious question, why is it so important for the US and the EU to team up, and what can we expect on this particular front?
Well, the artificial intelligence front is hot on the Trade and Technology Council and in general in transatlantic relations. And the latest visit of Ursula von der Leyen in the US, the talks with President Biden were dominated by the issue of ChatGPT, generative AI. What do we do about this? Is this an existential risk for humanity? Do we listen to the sirens of those tech experts that would like to stop, to press pause on the development of artificial intelligence? Does this give an advantage to China? Because China doesn't necessarily press pause if the EU and the US impose a slowdown. So all this is part of the picture. And this is also why next week in Northern Sweden, there will be a dedicated panel on artificial intelligence in the fourth TTC ministerial that I will have the honor to moderate. And there the issue is what can the two blocks do together? And there is already, since December last year, an AI roadmap inside of one of these working groups, which is the working group 1 of the TTC. This roadmap has three main components. One is defining common concepts, terms, terminologies, approaches, so that when we talk about, bias in artificial intelligence or machine learning, we're actually referring to the same things. And that's already quite important as a blueprint for international standardization and cooperation. The second is a joint approach to standards in AI. There is a lot of concern as to the fact that the standardization world in AI is a little bit fragmented. Sometimes it's dominated by less democratic countries, and there is a risk that the future the definition of standards will not be global, but only fragmented in big blocks, right, if you wish. And so the EU and the US are trying to converge on their approach to standardization in key bodies such as the International Telecommunications Union or the IEEE or the ISO, IEC, all these acronyms of the international standardization bodies that I don't want to bother you with any longer. Then the third working group is about emerging risks. And so the EU and the US will sit down at the table with experts to understand where are the emerging risks from AI, how to tackle them in a joint way. And that's perhaps the most ambitious of all. I have the pleasure and the honor of being part of that process as well, in particular the first and the third working groups and roundtables within this roadmap. And so I think there will be interesting announcements next week. We will present a first list of terms we've agreed upon, but also a plan for how to discuss and how to take action to detect and discuss emerging risks and find policy solutions.
Yeah. Andrea, without wanting to throw you a real curveball here, but obviously we're talking about a conversation that's happening between the US and the EU on a front technology that has another important player. Let's face it, China. Where does such a conversation between the US and the EU leave those aspects where actually, one also needs to look at what's happening in China?
Well, the whole TTC very often has a third ghost player, right? Meaning that whatever is done between the US and the EU, and in particular, whatever comes from the US, is always China in the radar anyway. And that is also the case of artificial intelligence, where China has been developing very important technologies, has developing very important applications. Very often, it is also in a mode of emulation of what is happening in the US. Take the new wave of generative AI models, again, the GPT-4s and so on. China always has homologous solutions that come out 3 or 4 weeks after the American versions come out. So stopping, accelerating on the side of the US always has this additional potential concern of giving a competitive advantage to the other big player here in the room. At the same time, and interestingly, the artificial intelligence discussion is also a discussion on how to promote, in particular through generative AI, democratic values through policy approaches to generative AI. As an example, in China, it's already been made clear by the Communist Party that the equivalents to the GPTs in China will have to incarnate the spirit of socialism and the dogma of the Communist Party. So here is not just a battle in terms of competitiveness at the international level. It's a battle for democratic values. It's a battle for what kind of principles and what kind of solutions will prevail, not only in our territories, but also in developing countries around the world. So it's a geopolitical battle that really responds to the early insights by both Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin that declared a few years ago that those who come to dominate AI in the future will actually come to dominate the world.
Yeah. Andrea, so much at stake in this field, and great to get your insights on what will be happening in Sweden next week. Which leads me to a concluding question, and that is, when will you be happy when this meeting concludes? What does this particular fourth summit need to achieve? And also, what can we expect next?
Well, I think there are many things that can happen, and there are many things that can change at the very last minute. This has been the case in the first three ministerials. The agenda is always in flux until the very last minute. I actually think it would be great if the EU and the US could announce a joint commitment to develop a common policy for generative artificial intelligence, and to propose that to the rest of the world, potentially in the context of the Global Digital Compact. It would be great if the EU and the US would announce an ambitious path to coordinate subsidies to achieve an ambitious agenda on clean energy and more generally on climate. It would be fantastic if they also could reach agreement on more future actions, in particular on technology, in 6G, in quantum computing, and in digital identity. It would be great if they could announce also the expansion of their initial pilots on the deployment of information and communication technology infrastructure beyond the two countries that have been selected already a few months ago, Jamaica and Kenya, to other countries. So to see whether these two players can actually work together on field. And finally, if there could be an announcement in defense of good quality information, so against foreign information manipulation, and at the same time on the protection of so-called human rights defenders. So anyone who's in conflict zones that tries to defend and protect human rights, and it's very often at risk. All these are things that are on the table. It could be an interlocutory meeting where there is an incremental advance. But I think at this stage, in May, at the end of May 2023, a few months before, say a year, if you wish, before the EU elections, and a few months before the US elections, it's very important that the TTC shows to have the potential to be a game changer in global governance. And this is the occasion, the one-time opportunity. So I hope I will not come back from Sweden disappointed, and I hope actually I will be coming back from Sweden energized. That said, let's see if things work. We have on the EU side promised to the US side that we will be working only until sunset. The problem is that sunset is 11 p.m. and sunrise is 2:30 a.m. in northern Sweden. So I think it's going to be an intense meeting.
I can imagine. So probably then that location is either has been wisely chosen or was a very wrong choice, depending on your point of view. So we'll keep an eye on the north of Sweden next week. And Andrea, I hope you will come back to governance this week in the future to kind of discuss what is evolving in this field. Thanks so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure. Thank you, Roland.
And thanks to all our viewers for joining this episode of Governance This Week. We'll be back next time. Give us your comments, react to this episode, and let us know what you think about it, what you want us to talk about next. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Thank you.